They say cemeteries fall silent after midnight, but when I pressed my ear to the ground, the earth answered back. A whisper, soft as dirt shifting between bones, called my name from beneath the headstones. Tonight, Dread Scribe writes again. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling stories. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. And if there's a story you'd like me to cover next, I'd love to hear it too. I remember the air being unnaturally still that afternoon, as if the whole cemetery was holding its breath. I'd come there for the light, that soft, late autumn kind that turns marble gray into pale gold. Perfect for photography. The older section lay beyond the iron gate, where the ground sank unevenly, and the names on the stones had begun to erode, like memories dissolving in slow motion. I moved between them with my camera, catching patterns of ivy and shadow, thinking only about composition. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. At first it was faint, like a breeze trapped beneath the soil. A whisper, almost too quiet to separate from the wind. I crouched beside a cracked headstone half swallowed by moss. The inscription was difficult to read, but the date, 1892, glinted clear. The name was Evelyn, a child, barely 7 years old when she died. The whisper came again, soft and rhythmic, as if the earth itself was exhaling a story. My first thought was practical. Air pockets under the soil, or maybe groundwater movement. But then I heard it form syllables. My name, it didn't echo. It answered. The sound rose like breath against the underside of stone. My pulse surged. I stepped back, expecting to see someone playing a prank, but the cemetery was empty. Just a sea of leaning markers and skeletal trees. I forced a laugh, though it came out thin. My camera clicked automatically, capturing the grave's crack like a wound. When I reviewed the photo later, I noticed a blur near the base, as if the soil itself had shifted mid-shot. That night, curiosity pulled me deeper than fear. I searched archives online, hunting for anything about Evelyn. A small obituary surfaced, taken by fever, mourned by all. But in a forgotten folklore forum, I found something stranger. A mention of the listening stone, an old Appalachian belief that some graves could speak if the soul inside died mid-confession. It was said they whispered until someone listened. Skeptics dismissed it as old superstition, but the thread described one particular marker in the same cemetery, cracked down the middle by frost. The next day, I returned. Clouds pressed low and the scent of damp leaves clung to the air. Kneeling beside the stone again, I placed my hand against its cold surface. The texture felt wrong, too warm beneath the crack, like a pulse beneath marble skin. My breath fogged, curling down toward the soil as if drawn in. I whispered hello, half mocking, half testing myself. The reply came instantly, a tone so human it startled me backward. It said my name again, but slower this time, as if savoring it. The sound didn't emerge from the ground. It moved through it, a vibration, delicate but insistent. Every instinct told me to leave, yet I couldn't. There was something magnetic in the voice, something heartbreakingly fragile. I pressed my ear closer, trembling, unsure if I was searching for proof or absolution. The whisper shifted, no longer my name, but a sentence. A child's voice asking softly, "Can you hear me now?" The wind fell silent. My answer caught in my throat. I don't know why I whispered back. Maybe it was the way the question hovered, light as breath on glass, or leaves tilting toward the stone. I said yes, and ground answered with a hush like fabric being smoothed. The crack in marble trembled. "Can you hear me now?" Rose again, carrying images I couldn't own. Wet wool, a small hand closing on a ribbon, a window fogged. The cemetery blurred, color softened, sound rounded off like a record turning just shy of speed. I remembered mid-confession, a door left half open. What kind of confession could anchor itself to stone for a century? What stays unfinished long enough to borrow a stranger's mouth? I set the camera aside. The lens felt like a third eye. I told the voice my name, then asked Evelyn for hers, though I already knew it. The whisper poured through the crack like water through a seam, consonants dissolving, vowels rising like steam. Fever, 7. Mother asleep in a chair. Mud on the doctor's shoes. A bell rope that never moved. As she spoke, the air cooled and my breath became a white ribbon threading into the split marble. What she asked next surprised me more than the voice. Who did I leave behind? The cemetery tilted, and my memory slid loose like coins in a jar. A brother's voicemail I hadn't returned. Leaving my father's room early because the nurse said it was fine. Regret, I realized, is a mineral. It crystallizes in dark places and feeds on pressure. I said I wasn't sure. The whisper steadied like a hand finding a pulse. People think we vanish, she breathed. We become pressure, waiting for someone to listen. I felt a pooling then, a gathering around my knees, around the crack, around the part of me that came seeking light and texture. The ground wasn't only ground. It was a mouth relearning a last syllable. I asked what she had tried to confess. The wind rose like pages turning. A name I didn't recognize, a game by the river, a dare. She had hidden something, a ribbon, a key, a small tin locket, under the largest root of the yew that leaned over her grave, the one shaped like a bent elbow. I went to the tree. The bark felt like braided rope. At the base, the soil had slumped, as if something beneath had sighed. I dug with my fingers until my nails burned. A rusted tin surfaced, thin as a leaf. Inside lay a coil of faded blue and a scrap of paper, slanted in a child's hand. I was the one. The whisper fluttered, then thinned to a thread. I stood with dirt under my nails like ink, the sky the color of tarnished silver. A crow called, and the light sharpened the stones into an avenue of small storms. I asked if that was all she needed. For a moment, nothing. Then the voice returned, small, steady, older than 7. Now you listen for me, it said. The sentence followed me home like a low tide. In the weeks after, every silence felt inhabited. I visit without my camera, leaving room between breaths, the way you do when you are finally carried that kind of sincerity you can't dismiss, even when reason begs you to. He told me about the lantern before sundown, a wandering light that appeared at midnight, gliding through the headstones like a firefly searching for its own grave. He swore it wasn't a prank nor a reflection, but something older. His eyes had that sleepless glassiness of someone who had seen too much and said too little. Still, I smiled, thanked him for his time, and unpacked my equipment beside the oldest row of graves. I wasn't there to believe. I was there to measure. The cemetery breathed with a strange rhythm that night. Cold air exhaled from the earth itself. My tent stood between 2 leaning crosses, and around me, sensors blinked in silent intervals. The EMF meter pulsed steady, calm. My digital thermometer ticked every few seconds, marking a consistent 49 degrees. The moon was thin, barely a coin edge above the pines. I remember thinking how perfect the stillness was for data collection. But perfect stillness rarely stays that way. It began with sound, a soft metallic rasp, like the drag of chain against stone. I checked my watch, 11:58. Then a flicker appeared across the hill. At first I assumed it was someone's flashlight or the caretaker checking up on me, but the light didn't behave like a flashlight. It swayed, a slow, deliberate pendulum, weaving between markers, too steady to be random. My heart knocked against my ribs like it was trying to warn me of something ancient. I grabbed the camera and zoomed in. Through the viewfinder, the glow seemed alive. Its edges pulsed like the heartbeat of a dying ember. The EMF meter spiked once, then again, steady rhythm, matching the flicker's pace. I noted the readings aloud, forcing my voice to sound detached, scientific, when every instinct screamed that something beneath the calm was unraveling. I adjusted the sensor near the ground and unfroze. The soil vibrated faintly, as if someone beneath it was moving their hand just under the surface. The temperature dropped 8 degrees in seconds. The light stopped moving and hovered over a grave no larger than a child's bed. My equipment went silent, all readings flatlined, every screen dark. The only illumination came from that wandering flame, burning cold white now, brighter than before. I knelt, half in awe, half in defiance, whispering into my recorder that I was witnessing a rare natural phenomenon. Methane combustion, piezoelectric charge, anything to make sense of it. But deep down, reason was losing ground to something older than science. Then, the ground beneath the lantern shifted. The EMF meter flickered back on, but it wasn't random anymore. The pattern displayed was rhythmic, deliberate, unmistakable. I leaned closer, watching the numbers pulse in sequence. 100 beats per minute. Human heartbeat range. I froze as the soil thudded again. Once, twice, syncing perfectly with the digital pulse. Whatever was buried there wasn't resting. It was listening, and as I raised my head, The lantern turned, its light facing directly toward me. The light didn't just face me. It regarded me, its glow bent inward like an eye dilating around my presence. The cemetery around it vanished into darkness, each headstone becoming a silhouette of teeth against the horizon. I tried to tell myself it was an optical effect, the way lenses sometimes bend light. But the thought dissolved the moment the soil beneath my boots shifted like a sleeper turning in bed. I steadied the EMF meter again. The pulse was still there, 100 beats per minute, sharp and unwavering like a heart drumming under ice. I moved closer, every step feeling like it was being counted. The lantern retreated slowly, gliding backward but keeping its gaze on me. A path opened between graves, frost blooming across the grass in its wake. My breath turned into a silver thread before me. Somewhere inside, the part of me trained to measure and classify whispered, "Keep going." The part of me still human whispered, "Run." I stopped at the child-sized grave. The name carved into the stone had been eaten by lichen, leaving only the date, 1886. My sensors trembled in my hands. The EMF meter jumped to 120 beats per minute. Then something else joined it. A low thud rising through my boots like a knock from beneath a wooden floor. I pressed my palm to the ground. The thud answered my pulse. A whisper slid into the air, not a word but a vibration, like the hum of a power line before a storm. The lantern brightened, flaring white-blue, and the grave beneath it swelled, soil lifting in a shallow rise as though someone below was inhaling. My camera clicked uselessly. The lens fogged from the inside, capturing only blurred smears of light. I spoke softly into the recorder that the phenomenon was unexplained but observable, though my throat tightened around every syllable. Then the heartbeat moved. It shifted sideways under the soil, circling me like a predator testing distance. The EMF meter went wild, its beeps merging into a single scream. I pivoted, following the pulse as it slid under my tent. The lantern followed too, its glow bending low, casting my own shadow across the disturbed earth like a figure crouched over a secret. I lunged for the tent flap, but my hand brushed something warm, impossibly warm, on the ground. It pulsed once, twice, like a palm pressing back. The lantern's light narrowed, focusing into a thin column that cut straight through the tent fabric. My equipment died again. In the pitch black, I could still see the glow burning through my eyelids. The ground beneath me stilled. No heartbeat, no whisper, only my own breath scraping the cold air. I sat there until dawn leaked gray over the hills, my sensors dead, my notes meaningless. When I finally opened the tent, the cemetery lay empty, washed in pale light. But inside, next to my sleeping bag, the lantern still burned, steady, silent, waiting. It glowed without fuel or flame, and as the sun rose higher, it did not fade. The caretaker was right. Some lights belong to no living hand. The museum wanted authenticity, not horror. So I arrived at the cemetery with microphones the way a botanist brings lenses to a rare bloom. A pewter sky pressed low, drizzle needled the slate paths, and the stones smelled of wet chalk. I planted spaced omnis among the older markers, pressed 2 contact pickups to marble faces, and aimed a shotgun mic down the central lane like a compass needle. Every cable clicked into the recorder I trust more than most people. Sound, unlike memory, leaves numbers, and numbers behave when nothing else will. I checked the noise floor, 23 decibels, a woolen hush. A distant road murmured like an obedient river. Birds traded dusk for distance. I logged the slate, audio slate, not headstone, and let the grounds breathe into my gear. Wind combed the cedars with a sibilant hand. A fly tested the windscreen, each step magnified into cathedral echoes. The place felt patient, like a library that had forgiven whispers. I told myself I was gathering texture, nothing a skeptic couldn't fold into neat paragraphs. But what texture waits for the recorder to listen before it speaks? Near the soldier's plot, drizzle thinned to mist and temperature slipped 4 degrees. The contact pickups reported micro rumbles I couldn't feel through my boots, a slow tectonic quiver like a sleeper turning under blankets. I made a note to blame trucks, though the highway slept 10 miles away. I narrowed the preamps, high-passed at 80 hertz, and walked the lane with open back cans. The cemetery sounded like a lung, each gust an exhale, each lull a held breath. Something, however, was altering the inhale. as though a second mouth had leaned close to borrow air. Back in the studio the next afternoon, I treated the files like relics. I built a clean composite, notched the traffic bans, and lifted air with a shy high shelf. That should have been enough. Yet when I magnified the spectrogram, a ladder of faint harmonics rose between ordinary lines, crooked but intentional, like a message woven into a scarf. The energy didn't sit on the grid. It threaded the quiet. Something was handwriting between notes, a filament of order snared in the weave of noise, and it made my scalp prickle. I isolated the anomaly and swept from 40 to 4,000 hertz. At 187 hertz, the shape steadied. A figure bloomed across the screen, round at the base, pointed at the top, repeating with metronomic certainty. It looked like a cardiogram drawn by light. The more I looped it, the more my chest adapted, as though my heart were matching steps with something older. Skepticism is a good winter coat. In that moment it felt thin, a button undone in a sudden wind. What was keeping time inside a cemetery that had surrendered its clocks? The voice arrived as tremor before tone. Not words at first, just consonant pressure, air over a bottle's lip. I added a formant tracker. Vowels stood one by one, shy animals leaving the trees. A name assembled from breath and grit, then another. These names belonged to nobody in the burial records. I cross-checked the ledger twice, then a third time, like a gambler counting losses. The list kept building, patient and precise, as if someone were reading at dawn to an audience unwilling. The harmonics flowered into human cadence. The waveform pulsed like a wrist pressed to glass. Deep in the bed of sound, a lower frequency lagged the others by a heartbeat. It felt like standing at a tunnel mouth while a train considered entering. The names continued, indifferent to awe, and the spectrogram brightened, as if the software finally recognized who had been speaking all along. I leaned closer and opened one more band below hearing, a door my caution had left closed. What answer would climb through if I invited it, and what would it take in return? Tonight, when the door opened, the sound didn't pour out. It inhaled. The waveform on screen folded inward, a negative pulse like silence learning to breathe. My monitors hissed, then steadied into a soft rhythm, a spectral pulse that rose and fell exactly 60 beats per minute. It wasn't interference. I had isolated every potential contaminant. The heartbeat was deliberate, patient, almost courteous, as if it had waited decades for someone to press record. I felt my own pulse hesitate, falling in step with the ghost of sound. Somewhere between data and dread, curiosity won. I applied spectral analysis, widening the window until the pulse became geometry. Each beat unfolded into a shape, loops within loops, like fingerprints made of air. The program rendered it in faint red, a heartbeat drawn not by blood, but by static. I slowed the playback to a crawl, 1 frame per second. The noise between beats started speaking again. Not whispering this time, reciting. The cadence reminded me of church eulogies, that quiet conviction people use when they read names of the lost. Only these names didn't match any on the cemetery register. The voice, low and unhurried, spoke as though each syllable had weight enough to anchor it to the living world. I leaned closer to the screen, every rational fiber unraveling 1 pixel at a time. The frequency curve stretched across the spectrum, dipping beneath the human range, into infrasound, the realm of earthquakes and elephants, frequencies that slip beneath conscious hearing, but still tremble the body. My speakers couldn't render it. I felt it instead, deep in my ribs, like the echo of something large moving under miles of water. The software clock froze for half a second, though my system had no reason to lag. Then, within that frozen frame, another name surfaced. It was mine. For a moment I thought I had misread the data or triggered a playback artifact. But the waveform spelled it clearly, each phoneme sculpted by precision no glitch could mimic. The voice spoke my name the way someone might test a locked door, slowly, twice. The spectrogram's heartbeat jumped to my own pace, 80 beats per minute. My reflection in the monitor glass didn't sync with me anymore. It blinked half a second late. That heartbeat pattern wasn't tracking me. It was leading. I pulled my headphones off, but the sound persisted, faint and internal, like tinnitus charged with intent. Every device around me showed the same spike. My phone, the audio interface, even the fridge's motor clicked in sympathy. The room pulsed with the same invisible rhythm, as though the voice had slipped free of circuitry and found new speakers, anything capable of vibrating. I hit stop. Nothing stopped. The voice had no more names to read, just one repeating lower each time, until it blurred beneath perception and became something felt instead of heard. I watched the levels flatten. The waveform faded, yet the pulse lingered, a phantom metronome embedded behind my sternum. That's when I understood. Sound doesn't die when it leaves the air. It hides in resonance, waiting for bone to remember the frequency. I still hear it sometimes, not through speakers, but beneath silence itself, the echo of my own name, calling from the noise I once thought I controlled. I grew up beside the old cemetery, a place more sculpted than haunted, where angels guarded graves with serene indifference. Their wings had eroded into soft ridges, their faces pale as candle wax. As a child, I used to believe they watched over the dead. As an adult, I understood they were just limestone and lichen, porous, patient, blind. Or at least, that's what I told myself until the caretaker mentioned how they seemed to move. He said every week their posture changed slightly, a tilt of the chin, a turn of the wrist, a subtle rearrangement of stone. I smiled politely, the way one does when humoring superstition. But curiosity, that small electric pulse, had already begun to crawl through me. When I started photographing the statues for a local history project, I noticed the differences myself. The angel by the east gate, the one with the broken wing, had its head angled higher than in the previous shot. The next week, its gaze seemed lower, almost sorrowful. The light could play tricks, I reasoned. Shadows lengthened differently in autumn. Refraction through rain could distort forms. I built my alibi from physics and lens behavior, stacking reason like sandbags against an incoming tide. Still, something in those marble faces felt aware. The more I returned, the heavier the air felt, as if the cemetery exhaled only when I wasn't looking. One statue in particular held my attention, a weeping angel near the back fence, its eyes perpetually cast downward. Yet, on one cold morning, I found it turned slightly toward the path, as though acknowledging my arrival. I crouched to adjust my tripod and heard a faint sound, not the creak of branches, but the distinct whisper of shifting gravel. When I looked up, everything was still. My rational mind sprinted to explanations. Ground frost, expansion, erosion. The language of denial was comforting, like reciting a prayer in reverse. But then came the condensation. That evening, as fog rolled through the graveyard like breath across glass, I noticed moisture gathering beneath the statue's eyes. Tiny beads formed, reflecting the dim amber of my flashlight. Condensation, yes. Humidity, stone temperature differentials, all valid theories. Yet the droplets didn't fall. They trembled, suspended there, like tears deciding whether to exist. My camera shook in my hand as I adjusted focus. The shutter clicked once, echoing too loudly. In that instant, the droplets rolled down the angel's cheeks. The movement was slow but unmistakable. A trick of light couldn't mimic gravity. My pulse thudded behind my eyes as I stepped back. The air felt thick, heavy with the scent of wet limestone. I told myself not to blink, that observation was safety, that watching kept things ordinary. But the angel's expression shifted in the corner of my vision, imperceptible yet undeniable, its mouth softening as if to speak. I blinked anyway. When I opened my eyes, the statue's face had tilted fully toward me. Its marble pupils reflected my flashlight like two pale moons, and though I couldn't hear anything, I felt it, a low vibration in my chest, as if something buried deep beneath the stone had finally started breathing. For days after, I convinced myself I'd misremembered. The human brain fills in gaps, I told myself. It wants patterns, meaning movement where there is none. I repeated that phrase like medication, daily, in small, reasonable doses. But every time I looked through the photos, the sequence betrayed me. The angel's face wasn't static. Across each frame, week by week, the head turned fraction by fraction, until the final shot where it faced directly forward, toward me. Not toward the path, not toward the graves, but dead center, as though acknowledging that I'd been watching all along. I brought measuring tools the next visit. Chalk lines, calipers, a plumb bob to mark position. I logged every angle, every shadow, determined to prove the movement impossible. Marble doesn't breathe, I wrote. It doesn't flex. It doesn't remember. Still, the following dawn, my chalk lines had been scuffed away. the gravel disturbed as though something with weight had shifted in the night. My heart pressed cold against my ribs. The caretaker hadn't been there. The gate had been locked from the inside. Somewhere between proof and denial, I realized the two could coexist. I wasn't there to solve it anymore. I was there to witness it. Fog came earlier that week, thicker, slower, clinging to the stone like a living skin. I walked the cemetery at dusk, recording ambient sound for the archive. Each footstep returned with a faint delay, as if the fog itself was answering me. When I reached the angel, I noticed fine fractures across its neck, shallow lines tracing the collarbone, converging where flesh might have been softest. My breath hitched. There was moisture again, but not just at the eyes this time. Thin veins of water slid along the wings, pooling beneath the base as though the statue had begun to thaw from within. The logical part of me, the part still wearing a scientist's armor, wanted to test the theory. I pressed my fingers to the marble. It wasn't cold. It felt faintly alive, like touching stone after lightning has struck nearby. Residual, charged. The air vibrated with a low hum, not sound exactly, but something beneath hearing. I backed away slowly, my flashlight trembling as the beam cut through mist. Then movement, small, almost tender. The angel's lips parted. Not a crack, not erosion. A deliberate shift. I froze, every instinct urging me to run, but the fog around me thickened until retreat became meaningless. The other statues loomed through the haze, dozens of them, every angel turned in the same direction. Their blank faces tilted slightly upward as if listening to something I couldn't hear. And in the center of it all, my angel, mine now, met my gaze its eyes, but this time it didn't tremble. The drops fell cleanly, splashing against the ground in rhythm, deliberate, almost human. I couldn't tell whether they mourned or warned. My flashlight flickered out. For a moment, total darkness. When light returned, the angel stood as it always had, still, perfect, expressionless. But I knew what I'd seen. When I looked away, their gaze didn't fade from my mind. It settled behind my eyelids, waiting for me to blink again. I discovered grave 314 by accident. Or at least, that's what I told myself. I'd been tasked with digitizing old cemetery records for the historical archives, a tedious process of matching brittle ledgers to modern maps. Most entries were predictable: names, dates, causes of death. But one column, near the bottom of a 1953 page, caught my eye. It listed grave 314, unidentified male, section C, coordinates missing. Every other entry aligned perfectly with plotted markers, yet this one hovered alone in bureaucratic limbo, like a ghost inside the paperwork. It shouldn't have mattered, but something about that number stayed lodged behind my ribs, an unanswered equation I couldn't shake. Section C lay near the oldest part of the grounds, where the graves sagged like collapsed chests. The caretaker's map ended before reaching that stretch. The soil there was darker, the grass thinner, as if light itself was reluctant to linger. I walked through rows of eroded markers until I reached an unmarked patch of earth, rectangular and slightly sunken, the right dimensions for a grave that time had chosen to forget. When I swept my metal detector across it, the machine let out a sharp metallic wail that vibrated through my bones. It wasn't the clean tone of buried iron or brass. It fluctuated, irregular, almost alive. I thought maybe an old coffin hinge or corroded artifacts left by the original burial crew. I dug carefully, expecting nothing more than rust and roots. But barely 6 inches down, my trowel struck something smooth. Not wood, not metal. Stone, maybe, though it pulsed faintly against the handle, as if responding to touch. I froze. The detector continued to chirp, each note louder than the last, until I turned it off entirely. The silence afterward was worse, heavy and deliberate, like the pause between heartbeats. Back at the records office, I searched for any mention of grave 314. The deeper I looked, the stranger it became. The 1953 coroner's report described an unidentified adult male body, advanced decomposition, distinguishing features absent. No fingerprints, no identifiable face. The jaw structure, they noted, was incongruous with human morphology. The phrasing was clinical, but the undertone was panic. A marginal note scribbled in pencil read, "Teeth non-human, specimen retained." There was no follow-up file. I reached out to the county archives. The clerk on the phone grew quiet when I mentioned the number. He said that file had been sealed for biological privacy, whatever that meant. When I pressed, he offered one last fragment, a detail that turned my curiosity into dread. The burial team had ordered the grave unmarked by special request of the attending pathologist, a Dr. Reeves. The name didn't appear in any medical registry. That night, I returned to the site, carrying only my flashlight and notebook. The soil looked disturbed, as if something had shifted beneath the surface since my last visit. I pressed my ear close and thought I heard a faint clicking sound, rhythmic, like teeth chattering under earth. I told myself it was water, a settling pipe, the echo of roots splitting stone. But when I turned to leave, I saw something impossible. The indentation in the ground was shallower than before, as though whatever was buried there was rising to meet the air. Sleep came in fragments that week, each one frayed by the sound of that clicking beneath the soil. I began hearing it everywhere, faint, irregular, like the tapping of fingernails inside hollow walls. I tried to bury myself in paperwork again, hoping logic could drown superstition. But the deeper I read, the less rational the records became. The coroner's sketches, faint but legible, showed a body with joints bent wrong, fingers fused into smooth arcs, and a skull too elongated to belong to any human lineage. Notes in the margin used terms like cartilage expansion and incomplete ossification, words more fitting for embryology than death. Whatever was found in grave 314 hadn't been finished. I needed confirmation. I drove to the archives in person, to the off-site storage where sealed files waited behind humidity-controlled glass. The clerk didn't meet my eyes when I asked again about the 1953 burial. He left and returned with a slim, water-stained folder, setting it on the counter like something too fragile, or too dangerous, to touch. Inside were two photographs. The first showed a coroner's table under harsh fluorescence. The shape on it was roughly human, but the face, it wasn't absence. It was refusal. Where features should have been, there was only smooth flesh, seamless, like wax pressed before it cooled. The second image focused on the jaw, rows of teeth unlike anything mammalian, translucent, irregular, interlocking like coral. The caption underneath read, "Specimen's dentition structure unknown. Containment advised. Containment, not burial." By the time I reached the cemetery again, night had folded over the trees. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I found the patch of soil. Only it wasn't a patch anymore. The earth had cracked open slightly, forming a seam. My breath fogged the cold air as I knelt beside it. The clicking was louder now, accompanied by a faint hum that I could feel through my knees. Low-frequency vibrations, rhythmic, steady as breathing. I brushed the dirt aside with my gloved hand until something pale glimmered beneath. Bone, I thought. But when I pressed the light closer, I saw the surface shift. Not breaking, not decomposing, but rearranging, as though remembering its shape. I stumbled back, the ground trembling with each step. The hum deepened, resonant, almost curious. Every instinct screamed to leave, but fascination is a slow poison. I dropped my recorder into the soil, its red light blinking beside that faintly moving shape. My voice cracked as I whispered notes, temperature, vibration, audio range. I was still pretending to study it, still clinging to reason like a rope fraying at both ends. Then the clicking stopped. The air around me went completely still. The seam of earth widened in one clean breath, the soil folding outward like the lid of a box. Inside there was no body, just the imprint of one, a hollow outline, still warm, pulsing faintly as if the ground itself remembered the shape that had once been there. I don't remember running, only the sound that followed me, not footsteps, but something dragging just beneath the surface, keeping pace. They said the grave was empty when reopened the next morning. Began the same way. I know it was. A hush that fell before the first drop, as though the sky was bracing for confession. I used to find comfort in that silence, sitting by the window of my small security outpost overlooking the cemetery, watching clouds knead themselves into darker shapes. But then, during one of those storms, I noticed her. A woman dressed entirely in black, kneeling before a grave near the farthest row. No umbrella, no attempt to hide from the rain. Her stillness unsettled me, like a photograph suspended in motion while the world blurred around her. At first, I assumed she was one of the regular mourners, the kind who find peace in routine visits. But it became harder to dismiss her after the third night. The rain poured hard enough to drown sound, yet every time I checked the live feed from the security camera, she was already there, in the same posture, facing the same grave. When lightning flashed, she appeared clearer, skin pale against the storm's silver light, head bowed as if listening for something beneath the soil. Curiosity, that dangerous whisper that ruins logic, made me rewind the footage. What I found fractured every rule of cause and effect. In each recording, the timestamp glitched right before the lightning struck, a skip backward of exactly 5 seconds. And in that skipped second, the woman appeared. Not walked into frame, not emerged from shadow, just materialized, as though the storm itself had conjured her. I checked every angle, every feed, even the thermal sensors. No trace of entry, only her. I told myself it was a compression error, static interference caused by voltage surges. It had to be. But the more I watched, the less mechanical it felt. Her movements weren't random. They were deliberate. In one frame, her head tilted slightly toward the camera as though acknowledging me. In the next, her reflection in the rain-slick ground lingered half a second longer than her body, as if refusing to obey her departure. That night, I couldn't shake the thought of her, not as an intruder, but as someone trapped. The way she clung to that grave didn't look like grief anymore. It looked like guilt. I waited for the next storm. It came 3 nights later, sweeping in with a low rumble that rattled the glass panes of my booth. I grabbed my umbrella, heart pacing against the thunder, and stepped into the downpour. The rain hit hard, cold enough to sting. My flashlight carved trembling beams through the mist. When I reached the far row, she was already there, kneeling as before. But something was different now. The grave she faced bore no name, only the weathered imprint of time. Her black dress clung to her like shadow given shape. I hesitated, 1 step away, my breath catching against the wind. Then a flash of lightning illuminated the puddle beside her feet, and I saw it clearly. Her reflection was moving, not following her, not mirroring, moving on its own. The reflection rippled but didn't dissolve, even after the lightning faded. It shifted like a figure trapped beneath glass, tilting its head toward me with a fraction of delay. My pulse thudded inside my palms as I gripped the umbrella tighter, every raindrop sounding like a nail against tin. The woman stayed kneeling, perfectly still, while her double in the water straightened slowly, turning its face toward mine. Its eyes were hollow, colorless, like 2 pinholes punched through night. I wanted to call out, to ask if she needed help, but the words stuck behind my teeth like stones. The storm pressed harder, wind pushing sheets of rain across the graves. My flashlight beam flickered and dimmed, bending strangely as it crossed the puddle, as though the reflection was swallowing light. I crouched low, trying to see her face. Up close, the rain fell around her without pattern, landing everywhere but on her shoulders. She was dry beneath the downpour, each drop curving away at the last moment like metal shavings from a magnet. Her hands trembled, not with cold, but with effort, as if she were clutching something invisible just above the soil. I forced myself to look at the grave marker. It was blank stone, edges chipped, no dates, no inscription. My heart dropped. In the security archives, every grave had a name, even the unclaimed. Yet this plot didn't exist on any map. It was a coordinate without an entry, a body without a story. The woman's reflection began mouthing something now, silent words that made the puddle's surface hiss. Each syllable broke apart before reaching my ears like thunder heard from miles away. But one fragment survived the static, please. Another flash of lightning tore the sky open. For an instant, I saw 2 women, the one kneeling before me and the one in the water, standing tall, arms reaching upward as though clawing at the surface. They overlapped perfectly for a breath, then split again. I stumbled back, slipping in the mud, the umbrella clattering to the ground. My hand brushed the stone, and it was warm, impossibly warm, pulsing faintly beneath my palm like a buried heart. When I looked up, she had risen. The rain fell straight through her now, distorting her edges like heat above asphalt. Her reflection stayed behind, still kneeling, still gripping the soil. She glanced over her shoulder at me, and for the first time, I saw her face. Not a stranger's, but a mirror of my own features blurred by grief. Her lips parted as if to speak, but instead she reached a trembling hand toward the blank stone. Lightning struck again. She vanished. The puddle rippled once, then went still. Only the rain remained, steady and cold, filling the hollow where she had knelt. My flashlight flickered back to life, revealing the grave marker glistening with water but bearing no reflection of me at all. And in that moment I understood. She hadn't been mourning someone she lost. She had been mourning herself. The old church had always been proud of its acoustics. Even a whisper could find its way into the rafters and return as something richer, like a note remembered by the building itself. As the youngest member of our volunteer choir, I spent most evenings in that echo chamber of stone and wood, watching sound behave like light, bending, reflecting, returning. It was the only place in town where silence felt sacred instead of lonely. We called it the Hollow, partly for its shape, partly because when you sang inside it, something invisible seemed to sing back. That night began like any other rehearsal. Rain hissed against the stained glass windows, and the scent of candle wax and wet dust filled the air. Our conductor lifted his hands, and the first chord bloomed, low and warm. The walls caught it immediately, amplifying every vowel until it sounded twice as large. I had been recording our sessions on a new condenser mic setup, hoping to analyze the reverb patterns for a small acoustic study I was doing for university. When the playback began later that night, I noticed it. An extra layer. Not static, not distortion. A harmony too deep, too deliberate to be accidental. I isolated the track. Beneath our voices ran another tone, resonant, sustained, impossibly low. It wasn't mechanical hum. It had phrasing breath. It rose and fell with us, almost anticipating each chord change. I thought perhaps it was a subharmonic reflection, the room's structure vibrating sympathetically. But when I tested the mics again, the sound persisted, even when we weren't singing. The next rehearsal I brought new equipment, high-frequency recorders, decibel meters, and a spectrum analyzer. We began with a simple hymn, something soft and familiar. Halfway through, a strange thing happened. The resonance shifted from background to presence. The pews themselves seemed to vibrate, a physical hum threading through our bodies. One of the altos stopped singing mid-verse. Her hand pressed against her throat as if the air had thickened. When we finished, no one spoke for several seconds. The room felt heavy with aftersound, like the walls were still humming long after we stopped. Later, I sent the recordings to a physicist I knew from the university. His reply was quick, almost dismissive. Standing waves, structural resonance. He said the building's dimensions might amplify certain frequencies, causing interference patterns that mimicked extra voices. It made sense on paper, but my instincts twisted against it. Standing waves don't breathe. They don't match pitch changes in real time, and they certainly don't whisper between notes. I decided to filter the recordings further, cutting everything above the human hearing range to isolate subsonic layers. What emerged wasn't random noise. It was rhythmic, a pattern of pulses spaced evenly, like words without vowels. Every few seconds, a deeper burst aligned perfectly with the sound of our inhalations, as though the silence itself was learning how to breathe with us. That's when I realized something unnerving. The church wasn't just echoing us anymore. I returned alone the next night, carrying only my laptop, 2 mics, and a coil of unease wound tight in my chest. Without the choir's voices, the church felt cavernous, its wooden beams arching like ribs above a hollow heart. My footsteps echoed back in slow waves, arriving a fraction later than they should have, as if someone invisible were pacing me. I set the mics in the center aisle and pressed record. At first, nothing, just the low hiss of old air. But then, in the monitor's waveform, faint ripples began to bloom, growing stronger, pulsing at a steady rhythm like a heartbeat beneath stone. I stood at the pulpit and hummed a single note. It climbed upward, thin and tentative, and the room caught it instantly, shaping it into something rounder. A second note slid under mine, deeper, older, resonating through the floorboards until my ankles tingled. I stopped humming, but the sound continued. A bass line that vibrated in my teeth, rising and falling with the cadence of my own breathing. The microphones flickered red with peaks far below the human register. The physicist's explanation echoed in my head, standing waves, resonance, nothing more. Yet every instinct told me this wasn't physics anymore. The sound was aware. It adjusted, matching the tempo of my pulse, speeding when I exhaled, slowing when I held my breath. I tested it, inhaling sharply, then standing still. The waveform on screen paused, held, and then pulsed once more, perfectly synced to the stutter of my heart. I moved down the aisle, past the pews worn smooth by generations of hands. The harmonies followed, soft at first, then blooming with a low, wordless gravity, like the ocean heard from inside a shell. Shapes of vibration seemed to press against the stained glass from within, faint halos warping the candlelight. I whispered into the microphone, asking no one in particular what they wanted. The room answered with a swell of subharmonic tones, not noise but cadence, the ghost of a melody older than language. The weight of it made my eyes water. I imagined voices trapped in the rafters, all the prayers ever spoken here blending into a single unfinished song. The pattern on my laptop shifted again, no longer random pulses but waveforms shaped like syllables. They weren't in any alphabet I knew, but their spacing mirrored speech, breathing between beats. The sound rose until the windows trembled. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the harmonies collapsed into a single note, low and resonant, filling the church like a lung at its deepest breath. I felt it vibrate inside my bones, a hum without end. My hands hovered over the stop button, but I couldn't press it. We stopped singing long ago, but something here hadn't. As the recording rolled on, the church itself kept humming in the silence, a hollow choir that no longer needed voices, only breath. The archive room smelled like old paper and quiet decay, the kind of scent that clings to centuries. I'd been cataloging the church's burial records for months, tracing yellowed ink and brittle parchment through a labyrinth of forgotten names. Most entries were predictable: ledgers, birth certificates, property deeds, but one box sat apart from the rest. Its wood was darker, water-stained, the lid carved with a pattern that looked like frost caught mid-thaw. Inside lay a single book, bound in cracked leather and sealed with twine hardened by time. A small label on the cover read, "Journal of A. Harrow, Gravekeeper, 1887. At first, it was just routine curiosity. The handwriting was formal but weary, the kind born from repetition and solitude. Harrow wrote of his duties with meticulous care, digging plots, maintaining records, ensuring the sanctity of rest. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. His lines grew shorter, ink darker, as if the words themselves began to tremble. He wrote of winter nights when the frost grew thick enough to sing, and of how the ground rose and fell like shallow breath. He described hearing faint sounds beneath the soil, rhythmic, steady human. I leaned closer to the page, tracing his words with my gloved fingertip. "Bodies that breathe beneath the frost," he'd written, the phrase underlined twice. A part of me wanted to laugh, dismiss it as superstition from an overworked man in a desolate century. Yet something about his precision unsettled me. He wasn't trying to frighten anyone. He was documenting, recording, observing. The later entries grew disjointed, dates skipping erratically. He began counting nights instead of days. "The ground exhales," one line read. "The graves are restless." Another said, "The thaw reveals more than roots." By the time I reached the second to last entry, the ink bled into the page like bruised water, smearing around words I couldn't quite decipher, but the final entry stopped me cold. It began normally enough, a simple observation about the coldness of that February night. Then halfway through a sentence, the handwriting fractured. The line broke mid-word as though the pen had been yanked from his grasp. The ink spread outward, pooling like a dark fingerprint pressed from beneath the paper. I tilted the page under the lamp, and for a moment, I swore the stain glistened wet. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations: condensation, ink seepage, maybe the oils from his hand preserved by luck. But another part, the quieter one that surfaces when you're alone in places older than memory, whispered that I shouldn't be touching it at all. The page felt colder than the air around it, as if it remembered winter in its fibers. I turned the lamp away, trying to shake the feeling that something behind me was reading over my shoulder. The silence of the archive pressed close, heavy and deliberate. I decided to close the book, but when I reached for the cover, the faintest warmth pulsed through the leather. Steady, measured, like the echo of a heartbeat waiting to be heard again. I kept my hand on the cover, measuring the pulse the way you measure surf through sand. The warmth didn't radiate outward. It pooled, as if the leather were a cup collecting heat from elsewhere. I slipped off my gloves and touched skin to skin. A thrum answered, small, exact, a metronome buried in bark. The archive's air drew thin, the way a room cools when a window you can't see is open. I told myself it was nerves wearing evidence, but the beat held, stubborn, present, like a whisper that refuses to be misheard. I opened to the final page. Under the lamp, the unfinished sentence glistened like sap. A UV wand for watermark checks turned the sheet violet, and frostwork bloomed across the paper. It wasn't random. Arcs radiated from the fingerprint smear, little ribs curving toward the margin, as if breaths had been exhaled into the cellulose and frozen there. I said his name without meaning to. The arcs dimmed, then brightened again, answering like tide. Method kept me brave. I logged temperature, 3 degrees lower at the diary than ambient, and set my phone to record, expecting only room tone. Playback returned to cadence, not sound exactly, but pressure. It pulsed in 4s, the way someone breathes while speaking to stay calm. I placed my fingertip over the dash where his pen had quit. The paper yielded a fraction, like skin resisting a shallow needle, and the grain lifted against me. I should have locked the box and signed the chain of custody form. Instead, I carried the book to the nave, a dozen steps that felt like crossing a border. Snow stippled the churchyard. Through stained glass, the world turned powdered cobalt. The nave had its own weather, drafts without doors, candles guttering without hands, wood ticking like cooling bone. I set the journal on marble by the chancel and opened to the last page, both palms flat, half experiment, half prayer. The smear flexed, not outward, up. A bead of moisture rose beneath the ink, shaping a fingertip pressing through thin ice. Another followed, offset, as if someone felt for purchase from the other side. The stalled pen stroke woke. A filament of black crept forward and formed a letter, B, then R. With the slow authority of midnight frost, it spelled a word that wasn't a name. Breathe. The page warmed under my hands as the nave air fell colder, equal and opposite, like exchange across a membrane. Something moved beneath the marble. Not noise, only a tremor that lifted dust motes in a tiny tide. Harrow's line rang true. Bodies that breathe beneath the frost, ground rising and falling like shallow sleep. The rhythm matched my chest until I couldn't tell who led. Ink curled to the margin and stopped, waiting. The warmth did not stop. It pooled in my palms like animal trust, steady and patient, remembering me the way earth remembers a root. I closed the book because I was shaking. The leather printed my skin with a faint lattice like thawing hoarfrost. Even after I tied the twine and sealed the box, the sensation persisted. A measured pressure, a heat with pulse and memory. Back in the archive, I washed my hands until the water ran cold, but the iron tang clung like a thought you can't unsay. It hasn't faded. When I shut my eyes, the frostwork brightens behind the lids, and a gentle heat presses back, as if the page keeps breathing where I cannot see. I file the journal under glass and sign my name with a pen that feels newly alive. Later alone, I raise my hands and inhale. The smell of old ink still faintly lingers on my hands. Expansion was supposed to be straightforward, level the slope, extend the plots, modernize the grounds. But progress always has a way of disturbing what prefers to stay forgotten. The first sign came from the workers. They said the machine stalled for no reason, that their drills struck something soft one moment and hollow the next. Then came the reports of calling at night, low melodic tones drifting through the mist, like names sung underwater. I told myself it was imagination, a trick of wind and topography. But curiosity, like a loose thread, begged to be pulled. I arrived at dusk with my equipment, ground-penetrating radar, a portable sonar array, and my field recorder. The site was quiet except for the faint ticking of insects. The air felt heavier there, as if saturated with memory. I began the scan. Along the perimeter where the old map ended and the new development began, the soil was uneven, more disturbed than the record suggested. Every few meters, the sonar sent out pulses that came back warped, as if echoing off something not quite solid, not quite empty. Then, in the darkness, the sound came. Faint, but distinct. An elongated hum, rising and falling in a rhythm almost human. It wasn't music, not exactly. It felt older, elemental. I checked the frequencies on the recorder. No interference, no wind fluctuation. Yet the hum continued, threading through the static like a voice hiding beneath a whisper. The workers hadn't been lying. Something was calling. When the sonar data compiled, the image on my tablet made my stomach tighten. 13 outlines appeared beneath the soil, human-sized, arranged in 2 uneven rows. But they weren't laid flat like typical burials. Every figure faced upward, their heads tilted toward the surface. The depth readings placed them just below the frost line, as if they'd been intentionally shallow. My mind scrambled for logical explanations. Misaligned graves, historical overspill, burial collapse. But every measurement rejected coincidence. The symmetry was too deliberate, too careful. I logged the coordinates, but one outline, larger, deeper, stood apart from the rest, slightly offset, almost watching the others. When I adjusted the sonar gain, the sound returned, louder this time, no longer humming, but voicing. I couldn't make out words, but the cadence matched breath. Inhale, exhale, slow, synchronized. I froze, my breath hitching in response. The waveform on the screen spiked in perfect time with my own. The air turned electric, carrying the mineral scent of rain long before clouds arrived. The hum shifted to a note lower than hearing, a vibration that pressed through the soles of my boots. The soil trembled faintly and the outlines on the radar flickered as though something beneath had moved. I stepped back, but the ground seemed to breathe again, subtle, rising and falling in shallow waves. The realization came cold and certain. These weren't just remnants. Whatever lay beneath wasn't finished with being buried. I stayed frozen there, one boot half lifted, unable to decide whether I should run or kneel. The ground beneath me pulsed again, faint as a heartbeat muffled by distance. Each vibration felt purposeful, like the earth was choosing its tempo. I switched off the sonar, but the sound didn't stop. It simply changed, softening into something almost tender. It reminded me of a lullaby sung through a closed door, each note soaked in sorrow. I lowered the microphone closer to the soil, half expecting static. Instead, I heard voices, layered, echoing, fractured through time. They weren't speaking in unison, they were answering. I replayed the recording in disbelief. The waveform undulated like water, each peak shimmering with harmonics that didn't belong to any natural tone. My rational mind began assembling excuses: electromagnetic interference, subsurface resonance, geological tremor. But reason is brittle when the impossible feels intimate. The voices didn't drift away. They circled, growing clearer with every breath I took, until I realized the rhythm had aligned with mine again. When I inhaled, the ground seemed to exhale. When I held my breath, everything paused. It was as though the soil was waiting for me to lead. I dug. I shouldn't have, but curiosity is just another kind of faith. Each layer of dirt grew darker, wetter, like sediment that hadn't seen light since the century turned. About a foot down, the shovel struck something hollow, wood, or what was left of it. The box was smaller than a coffin, yet built with care, corners reinforced by iron nails. My flashlight beam caught on the grain of its surface, which rippled faintly, as though the wood itself was still breathing. I reached out. The temperature dropped instantly, sharp enough to sting my skin. Then came the scent, wet limestone and something metallic, like rust or blood long washed away. The lid gave easily, too easily, as though the air inside had been pressing upward for years. There was no body, no relic, just a scatter of pale fragments, bone, but not arranged like remains. They'd been placed deliberately, each piece angled toward the lid. I stared until I saw it, small etchings along the bone, carved with impossible precision. Lines curved into spirals that repeated, forming patterns like the waves I'd seen on the sonar display. A language written for listening instead of reading. The voices surged then, rising from a hum to a harmonic cry. My eardrums shivered. The dirt around the box trembled, collapsing inward as if the ground itself was taking a breath. I stumbled backward, dropping the recorder. The final sound it captured wasn't a word, but something worse. A drawn-out inhale, collective and immense, as though every mouth beneath the earth had found the same rhythm again. I fled before the rain began, but even as I reached the edge of the cemetery, I could still hear it, the melody threading through thunder, low and endless, calling from the soil that refused to sleep. I hear them now too, especially when it rains. The old gate had always been there, folded into the landscape like a scar, tall, black, and forever locked. Its iron vines curled around each other, rusted to the color of dried blood, and no one in town could remember when it last moved. Children whispered that it marked the border between consecrated ground and something older, something the church refused to bless. I had passed it countless times while documenting the cemetery's restoration, its silence unbroken even by the wind. But on the night of the eclipse, that silence felt wrong, expectant, almost human, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. I wasn't supposed to be there. The expansion project had ended weeks ago, and the grounds were officially sealed until spring. Yet something about the eclipse drew me back, the kind of pull that feels less like curiosity and more like compulsion. The moon was already half consumed when I arrived, the sky bruised purple and gray. Shadows bled together across the stones, and the temperature dropped so sharply it felt like walking into another century. I followed the gravel path to the gate, its spires rising like ribs against the dimming light. At first, nothing. Just the low hum of wind weaving through the ironwork. Then, beneath it, a sound that didn't belong. A faint metallic sigh, followed by a slow, groaning shift. I froze. The gate, untouched for decades, was moving. Its hinges cried softly as it crept open, not outward toward the road, but inward, toward the graves. It was a small movement, almost hesitant, yet deliberate. The air thickened. Gravity itself seemed to bend toward that dark threshold, drawing leaves, dust, and eventually, me. I stepped forward, compelled by something that was neither fear nor reason. The moment my boot crossed the threshold, the world dimmed, as though someone had lowered a curtain between me and the living. Sound dulled to a murmur. Even my heartbeat felt slower, deeper. The air carried a texture, heavy and cold, threaded with the faint scent of iron and rain. It wasn't absence I felt. It was density, a saturation of presence. Beyond the gate, the cemetery stretched infinitely, though the path I knew had vanished. The headstones were taller here, sharper, like vertebrae rising from the ground. The eclipse overhead had swallowed all color. Everything existed in gradients of gray and ash. And then came the whispers, hundreds of them, layered and low, forming something that wasn't quite language but felt familiar, as if memory itself had found a voice. Shapes gathered in the periphery, translucent figures draped in faint light. I recognized them before I understood why. The child's whisper from beneath the cracked stone, the gravedigger's lantern glow, the choir's echo in the rafters, all of them here, woven from the same impossible air. They were waiting, not in menace, but in recognition. I realized then that this wasn't a place of punishment or peace. It was a place of memory, an archive of everything the living try to bury. The gate behind me creaked again, but it didn't close without moving, the way tide comes in by changing the shape of the shore. Faces I had known only as data, spectrograms, ledgers, a trembling line of ink, resolved into presence. The child's listening stone glimmered with a dim interior light. The lantern hovered at knee height, its flame breathing rather than burning. The angel's marble gaze held condensation that refused to fall. Sound gathered like birds at dusk. When I inhaled, everything else exhaled. The cemetery, or whatever lay beneath the word, breathed in a rhythm that borrowed mine and returned it. Altered. Like a note played back through an older instrument, I told myself I would observe, catalog, remain a lens and nothing more. But the air made that impossible. It held a gravity of regard, like being recognized in a crowd by someone you cannot place. The ground underfoot felt elastic, compressing slightly and rising again, as if remembering every step I had ever taken here. Names lifted from nowhere, syllables drying on my tongue like leaves. The choir's low notes swelled through the ribs of the earth, an organ made of distance, and the nave's hush unfurled inside my chest like a curtain raising itself. Ahead, the path narrowed into a corridor of iron thorns. The gate's vines grew here too, looping inward, braiding into archways that repeated toward a vanishing point. At the smallest arch, I saw a journal resting open, its frostwork pulsing with a shy warmth. Beyond it lay a rectangle of soil shallow as a breath, its imprint still warm where a body had been and never consented to one name. The unmarked patch answered my pulse with the softest click, like teeth turning toward a word. But what word could hold all the unfinished ones? A wind moved without direction and carried rain that wasn't wet, only weight. Shadows of umbrellas skimmed the ground where no living hand held them. In the pooled ash light, a woman in black rose from one knee, her reflection climbing slower, as if time were a ladder only echoes could trust. She touched a blank stone and it trembled like a mouth preparing a vow. I had chased her through storms. Now she returned me to a weather that belonged to no sky. The world on this side felt composed of aftermaths, the way a tide pool holds a map of the sea that left it. I reached the center without remembering the distance. There stood the gate again, impossibly framing the same graves from the far side. It was open as before, but I understood the hinge at last. It did not swing on iron, it swung on attention. Each story I had gathered was a hand on that hinge, each measurement a turning. The dead, or whatever word is truer, were not demanding belief. They were asking for witness, the way a mirror asks only that you stand still. I stepped back through. The colors returned slowly, like blood waking a sleeping limb. Wind reclaimed its noise, crickets resumed their petty arguments, and the moon unclenched. Behind me the gate neither shut nor waited. It breathed once faintly, and rust settled like dust after a sentence. I touched the bars and felt them warm with remembered pressure. I realized then the cemetery had never been a place for the dead. It was a mirror for the living, and tonight it reflected me. Subscribe, if you dare.